My name is Bethany Mackey. I'm the Executive Director of Progressive Multiplier Fund and Action Fund, and have the honor of serving as moderator for this amazing panel today. Progressive Multiplier is a nonprofit organization dedicated to shifting the progressive movement towards scale, self-determination, and sustainability by supporting independent revenue generation projects and the catalytic capacities that help people do that independent revenue generation. You can't get into IRG, as we call it, without talking about the tech that's grown up and around those fundraising endeavors, like constituent relationship management systems, or CRMs, which is what we're going to be diving deep into today. I am particularly excited for this conversation because my career was really shaped by the advent of CRMs and their use in nonprofit fundraising. I will tell you, getting ready for this panel, has made me feel I have earned lots of the gray hair that I have, because I really had the privilege of being there at the outset of when nonprofit tech started to go big. 20 years ago, I was the Associate Director of Fundraising and Marketing at the Alzheimer's Association Greater Pennsylvania chapter, and ran memory walk throughout the state of Pennsylvania for Alzheimer's Association. And we used to do traditional peer-to-peer fundraising. Everybody got envelopes, you went door to door, you got cash, you got checks, people turned in cash, big tents on the day of the walk, and you had to hire policemen to help you get it to the bank after the walk. I know I'm dating myself here. During my tenure at the Alzheimer's Association, they started using a platform called Kintera that had a peer-to-peer module called Friendraiser. And that is when my journey with CRMs went to town. So starting with peer-to-peer fundraising, that was really one of the very first, along with major gift work, that really got a lot of tech emphasis within the nonprofit sector. One of the things that made me fall in love with online fundraising and constituent relationship management systems is that it is the ultimate Trojan horse to address pretty much every organizational change management need an organization has. Because to do CRMs right, your entire organization has to be in line about the audience you serve, how you segment them, what you're going to offer them, how you're going to talk to them, what their lifespan looks like with you. So to do CRMs right, you really have to make sure that your organization is really aligned in how you're running your program. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really passionate about the tech influence. As my career progressed from working at the chapter level with Alzheimer's, I worked at the national level at American Diabetes Association, and then as a consultant, both at Merkel and at Forward PMX, which is now Allied Global. So I've had to work with groups of all shapes and sizes around both the people, process, and tech required to support their revenue generation. CRMs has been a constant conversation, regardless of the size or maturity of the organization. So we wanted to get in today what some of the current concerns that we're hearing from the grantees that we are working with about CRMs. This is not a new story, but there are definitely some very new wrinkles with the introduction of private equity investors into the nonprofit tech space. So we have with us today three of our amazing colleagues within the progressive ecosystem to talk about CRMs. How do we figure out what the right one is? How do we deal with some of those change management issues so we're not just buying software and not using it correctly? How do we be aware of things like private equity as it should influence our buying decisions? Please keep the questions coming in the chat. We will definitely do Q&A at the end. But want to really hand this over to our panelists now for introductions. First, we have Farhad Choksi. Farhad is a data practitioner with nearly a decade of experience working with local, state, and nationwide campaigns and progressive causes. He currently works as a partner success manager at Community Tech Alliance, where he supports clients and partners with their data infrastructure needs. And prior to that, he was the senior data manager at Leaders Igniting Transformation, which is a statewide org building political power for Black and Brown youth in Wisconsin. So Farhad, we're thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks, Bethany.
Also on our panel today is Haley Bash. Haley is a grassroots fundraiser, distributed organizer, and facilitator with 10 years experience in the social movement sector. They are a founder and executive director of Donor Organizer Hub, which is a launch pad and community for people who fundraise for movement causes from their networks. Before their time in movement spaces, Haley was a software engineer for environmental, social, and governance robo-advisor Open Invest, where they developed the methodology and data partnerships to create the world's first prison industrial complex divestment product available to retail investors. Haley began their career as an investment banking analyst, where they learned the power of spreadsheets and the urgency of addressing the injustices of our resourcing systems. So welcome, Haley. Excited to have your voice on the panel today as well. And finally, we have Kirsty Kimball, who has 15 years of movement experience, from traveling the country to hit the doors to doubling budgets for movement organizations. Kirsty's been a great partner to Progressive Multiplier and its grantees. Just a few years ago in 2020-21, she founded Build Power Strategies, where she works on everything from building powerful fundraising suites to hiring their group's next leaders to overhauling data operations to creating a more human-focused culture to providing gap support when groups' current fundraising leaders take another opportunity or go on parental leave. So Kirsty, happy to have you with us today as well.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. So let's go ahead and dive into questions. We had lots of folks who asked questions of us on the panel. We're going to sprinkle those throughout this conversation. For any that were asked that we don't get to, we will be doing a blog series very specific to those questions. So be on the lookout for all of the content that will be coming out around that. So I wanted to start with just a broad, sort of meta question around trends. So we know that one of the trends that we've seen based on conversations with the groups that we work with is that there is a gap between sort of their understanding of the tech space, the progressives tech space, that the CRMs that they're buying are operating within, and how it's affecting sort of the tool sets they're getting, the customer service they're getting, and things like that. So would just like to start us out with a level set on what shifts or trends in that tech ecosystem should movement fundraisers be paying attention to when it comes to the CRMs that they're currently using or getting ready to buy. Kirsty, can I throw to you first?
Yeah, of course. I hear this a lot from people, and they're saying things like, we really, really want a database with good customer service. And it's a big shift that I've seen across databases as a whole. I'm getting emails all the time from people talking about all of the problems that they're having with their customer service in the database. Like, I'm waiting 3 weeks for a response. I had this happen to me live this morning. Somebody was like, hey, we've been waiting for 3 weeks for a response on this. Can we just contract you to do this one thing for us? And then sometimes when you get the response, it's not actually the right response that you need. So I would say like almost every database right now is cutting their customer service teams in some way, shape, or form. I'm seeing a huge shift in that over the last 5 years. We're seeing layoffs across all sorts of different CRM systems. The skill level and the people that are getting hired is declining because the pay is less as people are sort of becoming conglomerates. And I think it's important to know that sort of the place we're in right now, movement wide across the sector, with any database you're going to look at. And it wasn't true 3 years ago, but is now true for every database that I'm working in, that customer service is declining. So I think people should know that if you really are going to need support, that you either need to get someone on your team trained to do all of the support that you're going to need, or bring someone in order to provide that support, because you used to get really advanced answers from customer service teams and databases, and we're not seeing that anymore. So for me, like, my favorite database is Every Action. I do Every Action database transitions all the time. It's still my favorite database, but they've had layoffs, slower response times, longer transition times into the database. Like, some people are waiting 4 months to get their data loaded into the database. So I'm recommending some people without the ability to manage their tech themselves go into different databases now because of that, even though I've always recommended them like ongoing. And I think we're just seeing this across the sector, that there's like delays, there's a lot more challenges with customer service, and I think organizations need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, chiming in there, I'm also hearing a lot about complaints around customer service from organizations. And it's not just the customer service that's a big pain point for folks, but there's just this stagnation around fixing bugs, releasing new features, fixing the old stuff that should have been fixed 4 months ago, especially like a critical election year.
Yeah, Farhad and Kirsty, I hear you both on that. The degradation of customer support, and particularly that more advanced tech support, as well as the lack of transparency that we're hearing from the product development teams, are trends I would definitely call out for progressive groups that are experiencing the pain or are looking to make a shift in their CRM. Um, it amazes me, when I think about the sort of behavior we would see from CRM platform 15, 20 years ago, let alone like the 3 years ago of, here's the webinar of the new features that's coming out, having a rep who actually knew how you use the product. That sort of service level isn't there anymore. And I think it's really important to call out, especially for those in ED positions, that if you are going to invest in a CRM, having an internal database administrator, somebody who knows the system backwards and forwards, is really a goal to have, or some sort of transition of investing in help and then actually fully training and staffing your tech internally. I know I saw Polly Stamatopoulos, who's on our program team, on the call here, and that's something that our teams are always struggling with. Is there is a lot of times the purchase of a system, but not necessarily the training, documentation, and support of how to use it. So there's always that disconnect, and something that we really want to help groups out with. Haley, what are you hearing on this front?
One thing to keep in mind too is when we talk about private equity and CRMs, these sorts of cycles that we're seeing, it's not the first time that it's happened. It's just been a long time since it's happened. So there's different types of for-profit investment capital that comes to support these CRMs. So early on, when a startup starts out, if we think back to when Uber and Lyft first started out and they were like 10 free rides, $4 to $5 rides, everything was so nice and cheap. It was because there was a capital where they were saying, hey, we don't care about profit right now. Just bring in a bunch of new customers. And what we're experiencing right now is a different pendulum shift, specifically in the CRM market, where instead of focusing on growth, they're focusing entirely on profit. So, if we're not making them profit, they don't really care about us. A recent example from the connectors reporting is what's going on with ActionKit. So since they were acquired by Apex Partners, which consolidate a bunch of different tools that we use on the left, they laid off half their staff. And there was a grassroots campaign by Move On and some other folks that was able to bring back 2 of the laid off staff. But it's just not enough to actually support all of the organizations that rely on ActionKit for its work, have built integrations into it. And so what really happens is that our organizations get screwed because we depend on these things. We don't have alternatives. We're already connected to these tools, and we have to then search for new alternatives. So as somebody that has the intersection of experience, both as a software engineer, as a former finance worker, I see this come up time and time again. This is something that happened in the 2010s, and it's just showing up again. It's a cyclical thing based on where CRMs are in terms of Wall Street capital.
Yeah, absolutely, Haley. So the other thing is that I'm really seeing is the difference in what CRM providers think they are there for. When this sort of became big business 20 years ago, you really had Get Active, Convio, Blackbaud, and then there were sort of various scooping up in that Convio bought Conterra, Blackbaud bought Convio had gotten Get Active along the way. But the way that the companies really grew was to be hyper aligned with what their customers needed. So over the years, I had actually served on different national accounts teams of, where they would get all the folk together of who worked on large accounts to say, here are the functionalities that we need. And that would actually get baked into the product roadmaps. And that's really changed. you know, I don't want to call it necessarily a competitive innocence, but it was a competition that was really driven by customer need. And the thing that I'm seeing, and honestly still having a little trouble getting my hands around, is the competition as private equity has entered into the picture is very different. And we're seeing sort of the proliferation of point solutions. And I'd really like to discuss how should folks really think about going into that landscape of, are they buying a CRM, are they buying point solutions and stitching them together? So, and because I think private equity and that future of progressive tech is really changing what's on the menu for folks to buy. So, Farhad and Haley, I'd love to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to actually start by backing up a bit before going into progressive political tech and giving an example that I think is super interesting from the restaurant industry, probably because it's around lunchtime, right? So a few weeks ago, I think many of us heard that the news that, you know, the beloved chain Red Lobster is going out of business. And so the narrative around this was that Red Lobster is going out of business because they offered all you can eat shrimp. They priced this stuff out super cheaply, and now Red Lobster is closing down all across the country. But when you start to dig into this and you go back behind the scenes, it's a bit darker, right? So a private equity company called Golden Gate bought out Red Lobster in 2014 for about $2.1 billion. And it was really because the restaurants were sitting on what was considered valuable real estate. So you can guess what happens. Golden Gate sells off all of that real estate to another company. That other company forces Red Lobster to then go ahead and rent from their company itself. And so restaurants that were already breaking even, doing quote unquote mission critical work of feeding the masses, right, have this additional line item in their budget. So then the business has to cut costs in other areas. Food gets worse, customer service gets worse, portion sizes go down, staff gets downside. The same trends that we're seeing in the progressive tech market, right? And then 2 years after their initial purchase, right, Golden Gate cashes out their initial investment. And then a couple of weeks ago, we hear this news. And I think this is a huge danger of private equity. Whether you're talking about amazing American restaurants like Red Lobster or civic and nonprofit tech, right? It's going to, a lot of times, it's going to take a brand and run it into ground, strip it of its assets to make that cash. I know Haley kind of touched on this with the connector piece recently, but our friends at Van really started off organically to help progressives win elections. People used to call NGP the TurboTax of campaigns back in the early 2000s. But, you know, then Every Action acquired Van, Action Kit, Salsa Labs, Insight Partners, which is a VC firm, bought a giant stake in Every Action. Every Action gets rolled up into an acquisition with two more companies and gets acquired by Apex Partners, and that's where we are today. And honestly, I believe that all of Man Every Action staff, all of the nonprofit staff who are doing this work right now, really care deeply about winning elections, passing, you know, legislation that makes everyone's life better, and really progressing, you know, and championing these policies. But what's happening is that rather than treating these mission critical tools as movement led, movement owned, and movement operated, they're now operating at a private businesses whose bottom line is about generating revenue. And to Christy's point, right, a lot of folks in the space would say that's the reason we're noticing the degradation of service, how people are reaching out to platforms for help and don't hear for 3 weeks or more.
Yeah, to build it up what Farhad just mentioned. So basically what private equity firms do is they go in to look for these more depressed or slow growth industries, of which, you know, CRMs have been recently, and they totally overhaul them by cost cutting. So, you know, Farhad mentioned the example of Red Lobster. A darker example is quality of nursing home care the past decade or so. If we think about why aren't our loved ones being treated with the care and dignity and respect that they deserve? It's because a lot of these nursing home entities are now owned by private equity firms that aren't thinking about, you know, senior care, about our grandparents, our parents, and making sure that they have quality care. What they're thinking about is, okay, what can we do that's legal but can still hit our bottom line? So they will union bust, they will do mass layoffs, they will make sure that people don't get breaks, that, you know, overtime isn't really counted for them. And so that has a material impact on our loved ones' lives. And that shows up in our CRMs because, it starts to be, instead of how do we serve the customer's needs, which is when they're in that early stage growth, when they're like, how do we get more customers? It then becomes, who cares about the customer? They're already paying. How do we get more money by any means necessary?
Yeah. And is that any means necessary sort of the proliferation of unneeded tools, I think, is what we're seeing with a lot of the grantee groups that we're working with. So in talking, the groups that we work with are largely nascent or mid-mature groups. These aren't necessarily giant nonprofits who need like full-blown every module that Blackbaud, offers, or, they need something simple, good, basic, bread and butter. Even a solidly run like Airtable would do for a lot of groups. So I was on the phone recently with one of our Metro IAF affiliate groups, and their website was on Nation Builder. They take their donations, they're processed through PayPal, but they're still getting hit up for things like, oh, you should buy Hustle. And, when we are still, at that point of maturity of working on the good bread and butter. So that's just something that I think is really new in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, are all of these point solutions that are lower in cost than the broader CRMs, but are definitely, they're, to your point, they're more about that money by any means necessary.
Yeah, absolutely, Bethany. And, to build off of that too, another way that's shown up, Kirsty and I actually talked about this when we had our first conversation together, is it because they are divesting from tech and from customer service, these CRMs are, they're putting it all into sales still. And so what they're investing in is search engine optimization. So if you go to search, how to host a house party or how to do a peer-to-peer campaign, what comes up are these blog posts that are meant for folks that work at really well-staffed, very high resource nonprofit organizations like United Way. And so I run an organization that's focused on supporting a lot of volunteer fundraisers, and I'm currently in the process of co-authoring a book with Stephanie Roth called The Accidental Fundraiser, specifically because we have volunteer fundraisers that come to us and say, oh, Haley, I would love to raise money for XYZ grassroots group in Georgia. I want to get some friends together. But when I Googled it, they were talking about this capital campaign and I have to buy the software. And it's like, you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that. And that shows up especially for, emerging development staff as well. There aren't those best tools. And that's why Kirsty's school, the fundraiser school, is such a great, resource for our ecosystem, is to cut through that noise. But it's so different compared to, if I have a clog in my sink, I can Google something and get a nice YouTube video and my sink is unclogged. But I can't do the same in fundraising right now because for-profit CRMs are really focused entirely on just how do we get more people? And then once they get in, we don't need to care about them.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a minute, Haley, on you talking about sort of like what happens when you Google, and, Bethany, you saying like Airtable works for people. I was working with an organization. They were like, they wanted to pay me a lot of money to move them into a database. And I was like, you should still be an Airtable. You're not big enough to move, right? So I turn down people a lot who want to move into databases because I'm like, you have 100 donors. You can manage this for free in Airtable. Like, I will do this for you in 4 hours. And I think there's always a desire for like bigger and more tech. And I think we're under teched as a movement in general, but the solution is not necessarily to go into a CRM when you're so young that you don't even know what your needs are yet, and actually like sitting around in the system that like works for you at your size. And then once you are too big for that system, then moving. I think people are investing too early in CRMs, trying to solve like an overall movement tech problem that will not be solved by you moving into a CRM.
Yeah, that's a really, really fantastic point. I think that I don't want to say that it's predatory. I think, there are some really fantastic software companies, and then I think there are some really not fantastic software companies. I have certainly seen predatory selling, especially to smaller groups. We have some really big swath of smaller groups that are in the civic engagement space, and they seem to get hit a lot. And I think that we, as folks who are working within this ecosystem, getting involved in how do we make software partners, software businesses more of our partners in terms of being aligned with where the movement is headed. Because I think that, as I say, having seen this 20-year shift of, I remember going to a Convio conference and seeing all of the all of the engineers and the geeks that worked at nonprofits, sitting there with the development staff of the software company, doing like all night coding sessions and things like that. So it's like we have come a very far way from that. And now there just seems to be such a disconnect, and there, I think, is this gap of, between the sales approach and also the what does a group really need. Kirsty, to your point, like, is it an Airtable? Do they need a full blown CRM? And where can folks start looking for that non biased assistance in figuring something like that out? Of, what do they need? Um, Farhad, I'd love to hear your perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, it really boils down to the fact that this, on one hand, a lot of investment and a lot of money in progressive tech. And also on the other hand, like, you're not going to be making like billions of dollars. Like, no one's getting a golden balloon and getting rich overnight by working in progressive political tech. But when we treat these tools as if it's a means to simply make a profit, at the end of the day, it's a disservice to the entire movement. And the whole movement will then move a little slower because of that lack of innovation. Not to scare folks, but it's not like the other side is not investing heavily in their tech and resources.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about that slower movement, and where is it a good thing, and where is it hurting us? When we think about some of the conversations that our program team has with our grantees, they bring out like, what should we be doing about AI? And it's like, can you run a basic report to tell me how your email performed out of your CRM yet? So, there is again, that disconnect that we're seeing, where there are some of these things like a generative AI, where you've got, a lot of innovation happening and a desire for adoption. But again, that gap, that I think where that collective infrastructure issue is, and it can be really overwhelming for especially the groups that we talk to on a daily basis. So I'd love to sort of transition. There is definitely a shifted and kind of more treacherous landscape out there when it comes to buying the nonprofit tech. I'd love to be able to give our attendees today some real tools that they can take away from this call in terms of using when it comes to making their investment decisions, whether it's CRMs or a point solution. So the most popular question we got in these event registration forms was, which is the best CRM? Which is, this is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but there is no one right answer. Everybody on this call, depending on how they grew up in nonprofit tech and how they use it now, is a different favorite system and why, all valid. But what we want to talk about is how to vet CRMs and identify what best fits your organization. So I'd love to start with Kirsty. When it comes to vetting CRMs, where should our attendees today start?
Yeah, so you should start with your peers. I used to make one recommendation for databases, and I don't make one recommendation for databases anymore. It was true that way for me for years. And I have realized that there's like a lot that has shifted in the sector. And what I always tell people to do, if you're not bringing in a consultant to help you, is ask the people who are doing similar work to you at a similar sized organization to you. So you can start by asking them, like, what's your database? Have little 20-minute meetings with them to ask them what their experience has been. Like, I can see in the Q&A chat, some people are like, I hate my CRM, right? Like, I want to get out of my CRM. What am I missing? And then some people will tell you that they love that same CRM. And so you're able to hear from all sides, all points of view about what people like, what people don't like. And you can also be like, oh, I'm more like this group of people in terms of how I think about my data. And so I'm going to hate that CRM too. Or the complaints that they have about this CRM, I don't actually need those tools in my CRM, so that won't bug me, right? So you start to talk to people. What do you like? What don't you like? What are you neutral about? And I think a lot of people will look at like the big orgs in their sector, and they'll go to like the $8 million org and your budget's like $200K. That is not going to help you. That $8 million organization has more than one staff person who's gotten professional training. Like, I can tell you there are organizations that have $8 million that are paying $50K for coaching, consulting, and entrance into their database. You don't have that money, you are not getting the same experience in your database, like onboarding and in your process, as that database. So, as that org. So you want to make sure you're asking people with similar size budget to you. So my main piece of advice is you want to do a lot of research up front, and you should never take the references that CRMs give for clients because they're all going to be positive, which, like, yeah, I'm like not mad about that, right? But they're all going to be super positive. I will also tell you most CRMs will like have them a new client. It's often like they just got into their system. They don't actually know how to use it. And so they're like, it's great. And they actually have not realized that they had errors in their data upload. So that's a big thing that I would recommend you do. And you'll get honest reviews when you ask your community. I always tell people choosing a CRM is a bit like being in a relationship. You are not just choosing the things you like about the person, you're choosing the challenges you can deal with in a romantic partner. Like if you don't care if they do the dishes, that's who you're picking. If you hate that they can't take out the trash and they never take out the trash, that's probably not going to work, right? And so we're trying to choose our challenges as well as the positive things that we like. So everybody should be giving you hard things about their database, and you should be able to say, like, that hard thing I can deal with, that hard thing I can't deal with, and make a decision based on the hard stuff as well as the good stuff about the database. So like if you think that you need a really robust major donor system and you can deal with bad customer support because you have a super techie person on your team, great. That's a good database for you, right? The one that has the good system and the bad customer support. If you can't deal with bad customer support because you don't have techie people on your team and you don't need a major donor system, then you might go with the like less robust system that has the support that you need. And both of those options are right, right? So there is no best database, like Bethany was saying. It's all based on what you need as an organization. And so for me, it's like every database has limitations, every database is imperfect, and you have to choose the imperfections that you think your organization is going to be okay with. And yeah, I think like go to your peers first, then go to the database. Like don't even start vetting any of the databases before you've talked to your peers. Don't get into those sales conversations. They're so good. Like I'm not going to name the database, but there's one database that is like, I tell people I will never recommend it unless you're the heir to the fortune of that database. And their sales team is so good that anybody who goes in there is like, it's great. And then I have to go in and demo it for them. And they're like, oh, and I'm like, I know, because sales teams are really good. So like before you get the sales pitch, you need the real, because then you might not go into the sales pitch that's going to convince you if you've had people be like, across the board, I hate that database. So it's like my biggest piece of advice for you is peer first, database second.
Yeah,
So go off of what Chris.
I love that. In terms of, I think so many times our grantees have had the sales conversation first, and that is just that will almost always land you in the wrong system, is what we found. So I
will
cannot agree with you more to like talk to your peers first. And I love what Paul said in the chat of what's the problem you want to have and what problems are deal breakers, because literally no system is perfect, and I can't underscore enough the sort of the staffing. We think of people, process, and tech as one ecology. How you staff your CRM really changes what CRM you should buy. So I really appreciate all the things you called out there, Kirsty. Haley, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, plus one to everything Kirsty's saying. I'm seeing a lot of chatter in the chat of, tell us the one, which one? We've talked a bit about a couple of reasons why there isn't the one. Kirsty has mentioned, it depends on who you are, what you're looking to do. And Farhad has mentioned, that there's a lot more variables to think about in terms of, training folks and getting folks onboarded. There's another piece, honestly, with any technology across the board is that it's malleable. And what I mean by malleable is that, it's not static. What you see today in a demo from someplace, the product roadmap, depending on who's in charge of that product, it could go totally in a direction that's right with us. Like, oh my gosh, they added all these great features. I can get all these custom reports and all blah, blah, blah for my recurring donors. Or, there might be a certain point where that product leader leaves and then all of a sudden they just put in some new schlup and they're, like degraded service. All they're focused on is hospitals and universities and what their big needs are. And it's way too big for us small guys that are just trying to do, as you said, Bethany, the bread and butter. And so, that's just also a reason if I have drinks with one of you on the side, I'll give my off the cuff recommendations, but I try to avoid saying any one CRM is going to be the solution, if anything, just because software is always susceptible to change. But getting to the nitty gritty of, first you start out with your peers, ask all the nitty gritty. Where do we have power with CRMs? Not on the tech side, right? They don't want to listen to us in the product roadmap. Not on the support side. They take the 3 weeks or whatever else to get back to us. It's on the sales side. They have a lot of investment on the sales side. So once you've gotten some feedback from your peers, get more than one scheduled tour of the product. Ask for a trial account. Ask for a test account. Get your whole team together and ask them a bunch of Q&As. What you don't want to do is just be like, I'm so tired of this search. Like, this seems good enough. We'll leave it to the hypotheticals, or we'll find out when we get there. It's like, no, use that time to be crystal clear about, as Kirsty said, the things you can't deal with, those deal breakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a personal deal breaker for me. If a software company will not give me a trial, forget it. I'm not, because we're an intermediary. We've got grants coming in and out. I know some of the folks on the phone are in that same position. So yeah, we don't buy anything we can't try on. That is one of our deal breakers. And I want to acknowledge Nathaniel in terms of, are we going to spill some tea? We absolutely in Q&A can talk about our personal favorites and whys, and our personal non-favorites and whys, backed up by our own experience, as long as we caveat that with this is it may be a perfect solution for somebody else, but happy to get a little deeper there. Farhad, we've been kicking this around in terms of how do you vet? What are your perspectives on this?
Yeah, and so I want to plus one everything that Haley and Christy said, and I really think that there was a lot of insight in what Paul put in the chat, where everyone complains about their CRM because none is perfect, right? No CRM is going to necessarily completely destroy your program, and no CRM is going to completely save your program either. I think that going back to where we are, and thinking about where we are today, right? There's some organizations that are having these conversations a little more actively about wanting to move away from maybe a vendor that's just not a right fit anymore, and they want to migrate their data or move around, and thinking about how can orgs go about that. I think that customer service is a big part of that consideration that folks really need to consider, right? How is the customer service when it's going to be, 3 to 4 weeks before either election day, where, everything's always going to be going wrong 3 to 4 weeks before election day, no matter which election, right? Or, another side is if it's rapid response and you need to activate all your members and do that, what's that customer service going to be looking like? Is this vendor going to have my back that truly sees me less as a profit creating machine for me, or is it truly a partner and supports my mission? Or is this just going to be a vendor that's unfortunately understaffed and does not have the capacity to respond? And when we're thinking about migrations and moving data and all of that, migrations are also messy at times, and that's just the nature of data migrations. No matter how much you plan for them, there's always something that seems to be going that's not as smoothly as you hope you would. And they can be expensive. You might have to hire outside consultants to help with the migration. They can take a long time to do so. And just being grounded in reality, right, is that this is a tough ask for a lot of organizations to do, especially if they're doing running electoral program in 2024. But if you have the resources and the ability to do so, and you want to pull that trigger and go for it, organizations should totally feel empowered to. And so for orgs looking at tech investments, right, that might not be something that you want to do in the middle of a battleground election. I would recommend organizations see, these are the tools that we have access to. What can we supplement these tools with so we can get the job done in November, or a job done during our crunch time? And then once you're out of that crunch time phase and more into a planning sprint or a planning phase in December or whatever, you can start to think more broadly about your grand vision for your data and your data infrastructure. And I really encourage folks on the call to sit with it and not to rush the process, but take your time and map it out. Think about your strategic programmatic goals on what you want to achieve over the next couple of years. What are the tools that you should incorporate or need to have? And what are some of those nice to haves that will help you hit those goals? Really list them out And then of those tools, what is going to be able to sync back and have some kind of data warehousing or data backup, which tools of those will sync into a CRM, which of them will sync directly with each other. Find that out, map that out, and make sure you have that very clear and clarified. And so, by mapping that out and really visualizing that, and even speaking your data vision into existence, I think you're able to build something that's not really built haphazardly, but with more intentionality and aligned with your programmatic mission and vision.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Farhad. In that, just like we do multi-year strategic planning, or program development planning, our actual tech stack planning has to be part of that. I think we've always treated it as, like a capital investment. It usually has a fair size price tag to it. But in my mind, having a 3-year sort of map of that is your people, your process, your tech. How are you going to staff your tech? Can really help make sure that you are not jumping into a major financial commitment that you haven't fully thought through, especially when some of us are trying to really deal with the immediate need of what's ahead of us in November. You mentioned data warehouse, and I just want to, I don't want to gloss over that in terms of how is that different from a CRM?
That's a great question. So simply put, right, a data warehouse is a central place where you can store, analyze, and manipulate all the data from your tools, applications, data sources. Not to get too into the weeds, but a data warehouse is slightly different from what is considered a data lake. Data in a warehouse is typically structured as tables in a relational database. So every single column you see in your data warehouse is typically going to be a single variable, and every single row is going to be a single observation. And so typically, to make full use out of a data warehouse, you'll need someone on your team to be able to write some kind of SQL or SQL or another data language to manipulate it to draw out some insights. Comparatively, a CRM is a place where you're going to interact with the tool directly as a user. So the CRM will have a user interface, so you won't necessarily need to write any code. But you're limited to the CRM vendor specifications when it comes to things like reports and features, etc. And when you have a data warehouse is usually going to be CRM agnostic or tool agnostic, right? You can push and pull that data in as long as it's in the right formats. Thinking about it from an analogy I like to make is that this seems like riding a bus. It's going to get you in the direction where you need to go, and sometimes it's going to be a little more efficient to ride the bus than take your car, right? Versus a data warehouse is like a four-wheel, all-terrain vehicle, right, where you can pull out your insights and build custom dashboards and visualizations to really tell specific stories. Obviously, like when you take the bus, you just get on the bus and you ride the bus to your destination. It's easy, right? Versus the ATV, you have to manually drive it somewhere. If you don't know what you're doing, you might crash something, right, etc. But an ATV can take you exactly where you need to go, while the bus will, at best, just get you in that right direction. So the data warehouse is going to be that container that you're housing everything in, and that data is ultimately going to be your own, and you're going to retain that no matter who the vendor is.
You just stepped on, I think one of the things that has caused me the most angst in learning over the years, which is who owns the data and data equity and data security concerns when you're thinking about a CRM. Because I will tell you our personal story here at Progressive Multiplier. We lost about 2 years worth of grant making data. We had customization to code in Salesforce and lost most of our records underneath that. So, which was devastating to be able to fulfill our mission to say, here is what we accomplished, and here's what the progressive movement can learn. I think I saw corporate accountability on the call. Who's one of our very first grantees. Theirs was one of those records that we lost in that purge. So that who owns it, how can you get at it, etc., is of huge concern to me. So would love to hear from the panel, when vetting CRMs, how do you consider things like data equity, data security, data ownership? Kirsty, would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I'll start. If you haven't heard the phrase data equity before, 'cause it's kind of like a jargon term, it's essentially like what are the set of principles, what are the set of practices, what are the systems that you have in place to guide people who work with data related to people. Most of the time, that's what we're talking about here, through like taking care of your data, looking at justice, equity, inclusivity, all of those pieces. So that's data equity sort of in a nutshell. And that is like so broad and means so many different things to different people and so many different things to different organizations. So like one of the things that I'll just give an example of what you might not be thinking about looking at your database system that you should is what are pronoun options in that system? Can they be overridden? Can you have custom pronoun options? Can people change them on their own? Like I worked with an organization that was using incorrect pronouns for people because people couldn't change their pronouns in the system. And so they were just relying on the information being correct, but hadn't talked to someone in like 3 or 4 years. And they no longer use those pronouns. And so that is an important thing for you to think about. And then it's like almost every database that I use, the race and ethnicity options are like really sad and not going to get you what you need. And so you have to do things that are custom, like custom build outs, and like does the system allow you to do that? So there's often a lot around that we have to build out custom fields for. So I'm Jewish, and like the option in the database will be like Jewish. And it's like there are a lot of orgs I work with where they actually want to know, like, are you Mizrahi? Are you Ashkenazi? Are you Sephardi? Are you a Black Jew? Right? Do you identify as a multiracial Jew? All of those pieces are really important for us in a system, and most systems are not set up to do that. So if that matters to you, you have to choose a database that allows you to bake that information in and collect it on forms. So sometimes they'll be like, oh yeah, we can get you that information in the system, and then you go to like create your first online form and you're like, crap, I can't actually collect this. I have to collect it in a note and then put it into the system in the place I want it. And that's not going to work for you if this is what you care about with data equity. So there is no database that does that perfectly. None of them do it perfectly. And you just have to figure out every org is different, right? Like a Black led organization that's really looking at race, ethnicity, they need to make sure that they have that piece down. An organization that is really focused on, like trans youth, they need to make sure that they have sort of different pieces that are available to them. And every org should be looking at different pieces in their database. A couple other things that people don't think about is language justice. Can you have forms in multiple languages? Can people fill out the forms in multiple languages? Not every database gives you a Spanish option. And Spanish, I would say, is the base. But then there are some databases that like you actually can have 4 or 5 different languages in the database baked in. And so that is something that is really important, either from a front-facing perspective on forms or a back-facing perspective. Like if the database doesn't translate well into Spanish and you have Spanish speakers on your team, that's not the database that is going to be right for you. And then disability access. So how can it be read by a screen reader? Every database is going to be like, we can be read by a screen reader. I can tell you that some are better than others because I work with a lot of organizations that are looking at data from a disability equity perspective. And then there's also the question of how do the individuals on your team use their screen readers? And so you have to look at it from an individual point of view, because for some people, certain types of, like there's certain types of ways that you can use that make certain databases more legible than others to individual people. And then looking at like, what is the level of tech knowledge on your team? For me, from like an access perspective and equity, I think about like not just looking at the database that is the most like tech high and being like, who do we have on our team? So you're not like forcing people out of your organization who don't know as much about tech as other people do, which I have seen happen. Like people leave because they can't manage the database. For me, that's an equity perspective that I think a lot of people do not think about. So every organization should be thinking about these things. Nobody does all of these things together perfectly. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that like oftentimes when people give, they have to give based on the legal name on their credit card, and not everybody uses their legal name. And so you have this problem that happens where, let's say I give on my credit card, but I don't go by that name, it's going to put that name into the system. And you have to make sure that you have policies and protocols in place so that you're not emailing people with the name that they do not use. And that is something that like you actually have to create that system and protocol and process for yourself. It's often manual, like telling people to email you so you can change their name. But thinking about like, what are the things that you really need to think about from data equity, and then actually trying to get knowledge from your database about other people who are using the database in that way.
I really love that, Christian. I think thinking about data safety, one of my main concerns is around like data ownership, right? And I think it's really important that folks think about what's the backup plan. Where's their data going to be backed up? What happens when we wake up tomorrow and the first headline that we see is that a CRM that everyone uses just went down or went was sold off or is no longer going to be operational. And this happened earlier this year, not necessarily with a CRM, but with a tool that was called Deck, which a lot of progressive and nonprofit organizations used for onboarding digital audiences and taking data from the voter file and then being able to cut list and onboard those onto Facebook, Meta-based platforms, as well as other platforms. And what ended up happening is that one of like the major investors in Deck was, surprise, surprise, Sam Bankman-Fried, who, in case y'all have not seen, is no longer able to provide that kind of investment, right? And so digital organizers who were on the ground, who really wanted to run these amazing programs around like getting out to vote and turning out folks, really just had the rug pulled out under them. And they were unable to use a tool that were heavily, heavily reliant on. And so thinking about that broadly with CRMs, right? Like rather than that having be the case, having some sort of backup of everything you're doing at this point, I think is really the proactive way to go about things.
Yeah, Farhad, just to build off of what you said, this is why demystifying the tech space is so important for us as progressives. I know the tech space I'm based in the Bay Area, had a big old scandal over what happened with SBF, but that conversation hasn't really been translated over to us and the implications of that. And this goes back to the conversations we've been having about private equity, that if there's no accountability to the progressive movement in their ownership structure, if there isn't some kind of cooperative, not-for-profit, that'll be a whole separate conversation. But basically, if there isn't that accountability there, we're always going to end up in the same place. We're going to end up in the sort of, harm reduction strategy, for a lack of better phrasing. MoveOn and other folks were successfully able to get 2 engineers back to ActionKit, which is something, but it's working with pennies when we could be working with actual infrastructure. Another example, recently, Hustle, a popular peer-to-peer texting tool, was bought out and now is run by someone that then turned around and tweeted out a bunch of RFKs, anti-vax, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then suddenly we have a bunch of movement organizations that are like, wait, shoot, I'm using this platform. And, the person that's operating this platform is completely against my values. What do I do? Like, how do I shift? I've seen it in the chat a little bit of how do we plan to make those shifts? One thing to keep in mind is that the progressive political tech space is such a hard market because it's such a small market. And so when you do have a for-profit model, you can't get grants or donors. You can't get any kind of supplementary anything. And you're doing this very niche set of products for actually, overall in the nonprofit space, a very small set of organizations. So they're really susceptible to getting bought out by big corporations that ultimately just don't care. And so I'm all for making sure that our immediate needs are met, when we're kind of talking about what can serve my organization right now. But I think a conversation that also needs to be happening in parallel is how can we build collective movement infrastructure that's accountable to, that's owned by, and that's operated by us, the progressive movement.
Yeah, Haley, I think we need to do what we do best in this movement, which is organize. And I know that some conversations that we're having with other funding intermediaries that are interested in more permanent tech infrastructure and more catalytic capability infrastructure behind our revenue generation engines is very much a hot topic. So I'm going to ask you to put a pin in that one because I definitely want to come back to it. But I want to, there's a lot of chatter in the chat about, what happens if we want to switch CRMs. So I want to take us down that road so that we can be responsive to our folks in the chat of how do we think about going from beyond the peer vetting of buying something new and the cost allocation of how do we we've talked about making sure we know who owns a CRM. Is it, on the market to be sold off? Is there private equity involved? Things like that. So both ownership, peer review. What's the next piece when we start thinking about the cost analysis of a CRM buy or conversion? Kirsty, I know you help a lot with that, so I'd like to open it up with you.
Yeah, for sure. So this is one of the main things that I do. I help people change their CRM, and they always come to me and they say my budget's $2,000, and I'm like, that is not gonna cut it. So I'm gonna walk you through some of the different options that you have in moving into a CRM and some of the things that you might not be thinking about in terms of cost. So people often don't realize that the bigger your data set is, the more expensive your conversion is. So that's a thing for you to think about. That's why I tell some at work, stay in Airtable for a hot minute, because if you move into a new database at a $5,000 conversion and then you build that database up, it's actually harder for you to get the data out of that database than out of Airtable into the system that you eventually are going to need long term. And so I always tell people hold off until the tool, people have asked, how do I know when I'm ready? When the tool no longer works and you've done all of the things you can do to try to make the tool work. When the tool no longer works with the workarounds and you are struggling with your tool and need more infrastructure, that's when you're ready, and no sooner. So it's when the tool starts to be I cannot use it. So what I'll say is if you have very little data, your conversion, you could maybe DIY it. There's some people that come to me with a small budget. I'm like, do not waste your money on me. You have one spreadsheet, you can upload it. It's going to be easy peasy. So if you're baby teeny tiny data, you might be able to DIY it. That's probably not you if you're here. It's probably not you if you're here. So if you're uploading a few spreadsheets into a system, or you're uploading things from 4 or 5 teeny tiny baby systems, maybe it's $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 for you to do that data upload with no support. So that's nobody's going to come and help you even from the database. Sometimes there's some packages at some of these and I'm like, nobody, no assistance from inside at all, not even an hour, but that's the reality of it. As soon as you have a full database you need to transfer, these conversions run 15,000, 20,000. I one time had a quote out for 35,000 for someone to load their data into a system without support. Okay. That is just getting the data loaded into the system. That's not looking at me or any other consultant who might help you. And if you have a conversion running you 15K, you need a consultant to come in and help you. You just do. Your data set's too big. You don't actually know how to get into the system yet. So that's a thing that I always tell people, if you're looking at a 5-figure conversion cost, you should save a little bit more and bring in an expert, because it's going to be you're going to have errors in your data if you don't have a person who does this day in and day out helping you. I also see people don't realize the hidden costs of moving their databases. So a lot of platforms won't talk about it, but they'll hold your recurring donation information hostage. So Classy, one of my clients, to get their recurring donation information out of Classy, paid $15,000. $15,000. Now they had a lot of recurring donations, but it is something that I just like to flag for people that you might have a lot of hidden fees and you could sue them because you didn't sign a contract for it, but then you're going to be in a lawsuit for a long time and you just end up paying a lot of money. So this happens a lot. This is one hidden fee. There are other hidden fees that people will have and hold your data hostage in certain ways. And so this is why you want to communicate with your peers so they can give you some of this information. So let's say you have a ton of recurring donors. You have to get them out of your old system. You have a $15,000 conversion. That's $30K with no support and no help from an expert. And so that's what we're talking about for a lot of people. I would say that's on the higher end, but the average org I work with, just from their data, it's about $15K just to get the data loaded into their new system, not including stuff from me or other consultants. And you can't really negotiate it. You can't really debate on it. Sometimes you can get a discount from your new system, but it's not going to be all that much. And so people often will be like, okay, I'm going to choose a system that's cheaper now. It's cheaper for me to get into that system now. And then like 5 years later, they need to do another database conversion. And that's when their database conversion runs them $50K, because now they have way more data in their system. So I see a lot of people being like, I'm going to choose the cheapest conversion cost, as opposed to thinking long-term financial security in the organization of, when we're ready to move databases, we should move into one that we want to be in for a decade. So that's an important thing for people to know. And yeah, I mean, like, I work with people on this stuff all the time. And what I'll say is that it's expensive to hire someone, not because we're trying to, like, bleed organizations dry, but because it takes so much time for us to do this work. Like, we can't make the data work take any less time than it does. So like, the average database conversion for me, I'm spending somewhere between 100 and 300 hours on going through and combing through their data, doing all the stuff to deduplicate the data. I'm going through and making sure that there are no main errors. I'm recoding that data to the new system. I'm figuring out how to fix the things that were wrong in their first database so that it doesn't go into the system incorrectly. And so, like, to be really transparent, like, I've had people's fees for me be $5K, and I had somebody have a $45,000 like bill that they ended up paying me because they had no systems in their old database that were working for them, and they had to do a full overhaul. And so when you're looking at doing these conversions, you really should be thinking about at least a five-figure ticket, and you should shop around like really heavily and look at multiple consultants and figure out like what type of support do you need. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of organizations don't think about. They don't think about the cost analysis, and all of a sudden they just go into like a cheap database like Little Green Light. 4 years later, it's not meeting their needs. They have to start all over again. And that is just like the thing that I always tell people is like, I'd rather you be in your current database for 2 more years and save the money you need to do a conversion into a good database correctly than wind up in a database that's not going to meet your needs and cost you like closer to 6 figures than like closer to 20,000.
So, Kirsty, if you were bottom lining it and somebody was buying today, what I'm hearing is buy something that has growing room for you, as opposed to buying something that fits in this minute, and also that 100 to 300 hours, as somebody who works a lot on the resourcing between our staff, for those folks in the chat who have been talking about like, can I do a conversion before November? That's really a key piece of information if you have got data that does need some serious conversion work, a cleanup, recoding, things like that. Does that 100 to 300 hours, can that be completed before you need something ready to run for your GOTV efforts or whatever you are working on for November?
No. Yeah. I mean, here's what I'll tell you. If you reach out to most databases today and you say, I want to be in my new database by September, they'll say, sure, we'll get you in there. You're not going to be in there until December. So yeah. I tell all my clients, whatever timeline they give you, they are lying. And so you just like, that's another reason to talk to people. Like, I worked with an organization. We started working on their database conversion last January. We got all of our stuff in. We were running like rock stars on that. We did all of the prep we could do, got them all the data by March. They told us that we would be in the database by June. They didn't get into their database until November. And there was nothing that we could do. Like, we pushed it. We got some discounts here and there, but they were like, the data that you need, the load that you need is so advanced. And we have one person who can run that, and she's booked out until November. And so you need to book your database conversion in an off year, and you need to be ready for that database conversion to be significantly delayed. And that's another reason why it's nice to have a consultant on board who can help you be like, okay, here's all the stuff that we do in the meantime in your current database so that you can actually do your year-end fundraising in your new database start November.
Appreciate that. I think the other piece that I would call out that we have certainly gotten bitten by is the proficiency. So after you actually have the tool set up, that then getting everyone really hands-on keys and in it and training till they're proficient. You do not want to be trying to build proficiency during an election season or during end of year fundraising, correct?
Correct. And it takes about 18 months. I think that's a thing people need to know. That takes you 18 months. in order for you to be proficient as an organization in your database. And that's if you get coaching and training. A lot of people get really frustrated in the beginning and try to learn all the tools at once. When I work with people who put me on long-term contracts to train their team, we start by learning one tool, then we add the next, then we add the next, then we add the next. So you're also going to be functioning at a decreased capacity if you are learning your data tool in the best way possible. And like, if you are going to invest in one thing, like you're going to do your database overhaul on your own, invest in some training, and do not invest in training from the CRM. It's going to be garbage all of the time. I've never been in a CRM training that I thought was worth it. You need a person who's been a front-end user for years coming in and supporting you in your training.
I could not agree with that more. Farhad, I wanted to circle back around. So, Kirsty talked a lot about the CRM, sort of when to transition, costs of transition, things to look out for in terms of training and room to grow. When we circle back to the sort of concept of where does a data warehouse play in this when you're thinking about long-term road mapping and conversions, where does the data warehouse play?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I gotta admit, I'm pretty biased and believe that every organization needs a data warehouse, and I'm always happy to talk about it and see if it's a good fit for an organization. At CTA, really, our mission is to provide data warehousing and data infrastructure as building blocks to a progressive ecosystem at low or really no cost. And so, the reason why I think that data warehousing is so vital is that ultimately a organization's data really should be their own. It shouldn't be beholden to a CRM. It shouldn't be beholden to a tool. It should be their own. And so, really, any organization that has more than, honestly, two sources of data should consider having their data backed up and warehoused in a place that they can access it, God forbid something happens. And, I think the main challenge that a lot of organizations can face, especially at the small scale, is not really having data staff. And it's been something that I think the movement's been trying to work on. And we've got a couple of things we've been trying to build at CTA to make our features even easier for non-technical users to be able to utilize it. But that's the biggest barrier to entry. I think there's some great organizations like Change the Game, Generation Data, and Repower that really help train people who are already working within the progressive movement to be able to build amazing data and tech teams. I know Generation Data just announced their intermediate data engineering course this morning. And every organization really ultimately needs to invest in data staff. And it sounds funny, but data is the glue that holds organizations together. I've been in organizations and seen organizations where a data staffer really gets pushed off to the side or siloed, and where their main job is really to just pull list or cut turf or stuff like that. When in reality, data helps you figure out how to talk to folks on the ground better. Data helps you figure out what fundraising messages are working better. Data helps you figure out operationally how to manage your teams better. And I really think that data staffers need to be at the center of that conversation, and then organizations need to keep investing in them because they help really administer these tools and provide these insights and can be your ship's captain when these things are happening.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's important, especially if you're moving to a new CRM. You should invest in a data person. Oftentimes you will spend less if you just hire a data person than the money that you might spend on consultants. And the person then can do so much more for you than a consultant can do. I'm always like staff-oriented consultant as like a bridge. And so for me, it's like, it could be somebody who's currently on your team that you promote. It could be somebody brand new. Like if you're moving into a database, having someone on your team who can help you not make that messy, someone who can be there from the beginning, who can help you build up that database, who can sort of run all of the stuff on like getting everyone trained up, can be really, really nice. And it should be someone who has been a front-end user in that database for years, and they can train your staff on all the things that your staff need to be trained on. And like investment in tech and investment in data is often the last thing that we do at organizations, as opposed to us thinking that it can allow us to do so much more. And I think it's really important for people to think about like, how do I end up like getting somebody in here who can help us run our database? And in the long term, you'll save a lot of money because the trainings from professionals are not cheap. And if you have someone who is a data expert, in whatever system you use coming there, you're going to be able to like actually get really good data systems built, and then you are going to save so much money on potential consultants. So like 100% to what you said.
Yeah, and I think it's really ultimately about meeting people where they're at, right? Some organizations will just not like have the capacity or the money to invest in something fancy, and they'll be running their entire program on a few Google spreadsheets, and that's okay in some cases, right? But that means that all of your tools need to be able to run off spreadsheets, or take spreadsheets in as an intake as a source. And I think vendors on our side really need to be cognizant of that fact as well. Like some orgs may be working with just spreadsheets, some orgs may have a 10-person data team ready to go.
Absolutely, Farhad. I see so many missed opportunities for lower resource organizations because higher resource organizations can do very simple queries on their fancy CRMs to get the answers that they need. And they're in more sophisticated CRMs that advertise these queries to say, oh, you can see this, you can do that. And so for the folks that are in Airtable and Google Sheets, something that we often see be really supportive for folks is really just asking, do you have a friend, an aunt, just somebody who's kind of a data nerd? They're not in the movement space, but they kind of step in as a volunteer to support and help you out. And so thinking about, what kinds of things do we want to learn? Do we want to know, who would be good targets for our first recurring donors program, or, who has donated in the past year, even just, the sort of nuts and bolts of what these big CRMs do for us. You can oftentimes, we are always encouraged to, there are many brilliant consultants out there, but for those of us where it's like, I can't fork up that 5-figure amount that's expected to get the data infrastructure. Something that can be a band-aid in between, especially as you're in startup mode, is thinking about who in your network is comfortable with data that can help you parse that information out.
We've got about 20 minutes left in our conversation here. I feel like we could go another like 3 hours and get into the goods here. So for everyone on the phone, we will definitely be doing follow-up, both webinar and content. But we've got a good handful of questions in the Q&A, as well as ones that were submitted, and I want to get to as many as possible. So I'm going to go down them and throw them out to our panel. And again, if your question does not get answered, we commit to answering it in written or video form after this. So stay tuned on that. I'm looking at the upvoted questions here in the Q&A. So Molly asked for advice for small to mid-sized groups that are trying to integrate data between multiple tools. Larger orgs can use like a data warehouse, but in her experience, that's beyond the capacity of most of the social movement orgs. It's on her mind because as people are going to start leaving every action, but they're going to need multiple tools to replace EA. Molly, we are definitely hearing this from our grantees, so would love to hear what our panel has to say about sort of where every action is, what you used to as point solutions to replace it, and how do you integrate that data? It's a meaty one.
I can. I'm in every action all the time.
Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
So I think, and somebody else said, like, I hate every action. I want to get out of it. What am I missing? Every action is a tool that I think you need professional training in order to use in a way that makes sense. I think it used to be a super user-friendly tool. It's not anymore. Mm-hmm. In order for you to get some good, juicy, meaty stuff out of every action, you need a data person. And that's tough, right? Because not every organization can do it, and every organization is being funneled into every action. So I think every action is an incredibly powerful tool. I think there are challenges with it because it's now been acquired by Bonterra and they're not updating systems the way that they should be, and their customer service is not very good. But I think that, the challenges in terms of like looking at replacing tools with every action is that you have to replace email, you have to replace forms, you have to replace all of those internal data structures. For some of you that have integrations like Wealth Engine or Mobilize, you have to replace all of those. I did help an organization recently get out of every action, and we created sort of a like DIY data warehouse. It's like not really a data warehouse, but it functions as one place for everything to be. And we did that in Airtable. Airtable is powerful. And I think a lot of people don't like think about Airtable as a system for that, but we specifically chose tools that we could easily create integrations for into Airtable. They invested like $5K to get some good integrations into Airtable, and now they have a system that works for them. They have a different texting tool. They get all of their form information. Their donations come in from ActBlue. They have their email from MailChimp, and all of that information is now stored for them in Table. So my recommendation would be like, there's like lots, like Haley was talking about getting volunteers to do this type of stuff. There are a lot of people who know how to like do integrations into Airtable who would maybe volunteer that time for you. It's the most user-friendly system that I think. So for me, when I'm looking at orgs that are like, we can't afford a data warehouse, but we need most of our stuff all in one place. I'm like, we can DIY a like fakey one in Airtable, and that's the direction that I kind of send people into.
Just to build real quickly off of what Kirsty is talking about, to build those integrations quickly, there is a software called Zapier that allows for tools that don't have an integration together to actually talk to one another. And so that's, if you're looking specifically, how can we do that workaround in Airtable or whatever else, Zapier is going to be a great user-friendly tool.
Okay, yeah, we are definitely fans of that here. We are actually using Zapier to connect our data analytics pieces into our CRM so that we can do more data analysis. So appreciate everybody's perspective on that one. Another question from our Q&A here. Our biggest fear is that our current CRM, which is Nation Builder, will go away or change dramatically to not meet our needs. Does this crew have a sense of which CRMs might be vulnerable currently because of venture capital acquisitions and consolidations? What are you guys hearing about where the next big changes are going to be, a la the Bonterra piece?
I can start us on this one, and folks can chime in. So we're not in the big, executive boardrooms that are making these decisions, but some ways to get little loop arounds, making really good friends with the customer support or whoever you have in-house. I've heard some organizations be able to hear, oh my goodness, like after the layoffs of this organization, they don't have a product manager anymore, which if you don't have a product manager in an engineering team, you can more or less expect that that's just a cash cow and they're just letting it sit there to rot, because a product manager basically decides what's going to be new features and what are going to be bugs fixed. And if you're reaching out to support, oftentimes you want new features and bugs to be fixed. So making friends on the inside. In the progressive tech ecosystem, a lot of former tech workers that have been laid off by Every Action and similar organizations have been open. So really being able to make those connections, read up on what they're saying, because they are, the brave ones that are sharing the sort of insides, that Action Kit, for example, is more or less, kind of a dead product now. So a lot of this is going to be a lot of relational organizing, I'd say.
For me, how I tell people to start to assess this, like it's a thing we started to see with Salsa before they got acquired, is are new features coming out? Are bugs being fixed? If you stop seeing that, sometimes you can jump ship before the ship goes down. But I always like to have a check-in, whoever your account service manager person is, I like to have a check-in with them and talk to them about what's coming down the pike. And they will, like, I've had these conversations so often. Like, Every Action told me 4 years ago in a meeting, they're like, we're going to create a text email registration link, and it never came. And when you start to hear that type of stuff where they're like, we have this product in design and it never actually gets fulfilled and goes over the finish line, that tells you something about the state of the database. So that's my recommendation, is like, you can feel that stuff out yourself by actually talking to product and being like, what is coming? And if they tell you things are coming and they don't come, you can be like, all right, well, my database might be changing and there might be less investment in it, and that's a good thing for you to know.
Yeah. Plus one on the whole idea around bugs, like what bugs are being squashed and what features are getting rolled out. And like, as a customer service person, partner success person, right? Like, I am super excited whenever I have check-ins with my partners to be like, hey, like we just rolled out all these things. Like, I want to hear your feedback. I want to know what's like working for you, what's not working for you. I want to report this back to the product team and like just keep iterating. And if you're not getting that vibe from your account exec or partner success like person, like that's a bit of a red sign that you may just not have a good partner success person, but like it could also be that, that organization and that vendor's really not trying to innovate and not trying to really upgrade their systems.
Thanks all. Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A, and then I'm going to ask everybody to spill the tea. So Sean asked, how should an org think about evaluating CRMs when it wants the ability to use it outside of RevGen, like for membership management? Within revenue generation, how do we think about customizations when the donor segments are very different, like institutional versus small individual donors? Anybody want to take a crack at that one? All right, so just from our perspective, if you know you are going to want to track both institutional and individual donors in one system, put that on your requirements and specifications. So some of the older school tools that came out of like the Razor's Edge era are actually meant for that, because that was sort of the first place nonprofit tech went, was that major donor management system and that relationship moves management. They've, there are lots of versions of that. And what we advise is to look for CRMs that allow you to have different kinds of relationships. So within one database, being able to say someone is an institutional record versus an individual donor record versus a member record, and lets you control the fields actually at that contact record object. So you're really looking for something when you're talking to your peers first, and then once you get into a sales process, to making very clear that you have 3+ actual different types of contact records that need different data collected on them. So we can definitely get into more on that in our in the pieces that we are going to put out after this. Haley, Kirsty, Farhad, anything to add on that one? All right. Okay, so we have like 5 minutes left before we wrap up. I am going to ask everybody to spill the tea, and I will happily go first. So I'd ask everybody, with all the caveats of there is no one CRM that's best. We all have different requirements and specifications and the tools we're looking for, but also being real and saying the group that you've got on this panel has touched dozens of tech products over, between the four of us, probably, I'm going to say there's 70, 80 years of experience here, which is scary, but would love to hear who have you liked working with, the products that you respect, products that make you go, not my cup of tea. And I will happily go first. Progressive Multiplier started off as a Salesforce shop. I think Salesforce is a fantastically robust tool if you have a lot of money to customize it and staff it. And you can keep up with any customizations you make to it. So it is not one that I would recommend for most of the folks that we work with. They do not have the kind of staff, the people and process part to make Salesforce really a successful installation. We migrated to HubSpot as our CRM, which I think as a product we are very happy in. Our email, our website, all of our CRM data lives in there. It integrates fairly well with what we need it to. We have seen a real degradation in customer service over the past year as they have gone from their CMS to their content hub. So that's something we're keeping an eye on in terms of renewal. Probably my favorite tool that I have ever worked with as a fundraiser was Engaging Networks, in terms of an all-in-one when I was managing everything from small dollar donors, members, peer-to-peer. It's one of those systems that I think does a solid job around all the different pieces if you're managing a very diverse fundraising program. So that's my POV. Who's next?
I can jump in.
Go ahead,
So I come from more of a organizing and canvassing background in a few ways. And so, as folks know, there's this old adage, right? If it doesn't exist in van, it does not exist. And so I think that is something that a lot of organizers and tech folks really held on to that mantra. One of the tools that I'm really excited about, that I've seen a few demos and I think is really cool, is OpenField. And so OpenField is really rethinking a lot of ways on how we run really movement-led like organizing programs. And they're also in some ways data agnostic, I believe, and so have syncs with many of the major voter file vendors. So that is one that I am cautiously but hopefully very excited about.
I'm going to answer your question in a different way, Bethany, because I really am at this point like database agnostic. I actually just got someone into Salesforce because it's the best solution for them. Like I'm doing lots more custom stuff. So for me, I'm going to tell you where I would not go. So I would not go into Classy. It's going to cost you so much money to get your database out of Classy, and they often don't have service on New Year's Eve, which you need service on New Year's Eve. Very important for you to have some customer support on that date. I do not recommend that people go into Little Green Light. They have some sales team, and once people get into that database, they have a hard time in it. People also have a really hard time getting their database out of it. Exports out of Little Green Light are some of the most expensive that I do, and it shouldn't be that way as a simple database system. Those are the two that I tell people, like, if you're thinking about your data, I really recommend that you steer clear of them. And then also I would say Salsa. Right now, I haven't seen any feature updates. I haven't seen bugs getting fixed. And if I was in Salsa, maybe start thinking about like, what is my potential plan to get out of Salsa? And then if you are like considering moving into Salsa, I probably wouldn't, because I think it's going to get eaten by Every Action because it was purchased by the same firm that Every Action is under.
I'm going to be also a rebel and go on a little path here. I think ultimately when you're having these conversations with your peers, spending even just 5% of that time talking about the options that are built by and for and owned by progressive organizers, and maybe why it's not today, but how can it be over time, like OpenField, Action Network and Action Builder, the Movement Cooperative and Working Families Party are working on building their infrastructure internally that they want to share with broader movements. And so, really having that curiosity of, what are the tools that we need to actually use that? Because I've heard some people be like, oh, I like the idea of what they're doing, but they don't have these, very easily downloadable reports. And as an engineer, a downloadable report is actually very simple to engineer. So if these organizations can hear more of that, if there are funders in the room, investing in those folks, maybe allocating some money that normally goes toward, training your grantees on how to use their CRM, just like a tiny bit going to the CRMs that are meant for our ecosystem. But as you're going through the process, demystifying the idea of tech and how scary it is, be bold and ask those questions of what are the policies for data privacy with our CRM? Who actually owns our data? And then, kind of the visionary piece of what can our shared data infrastructure look like as progressives, what's already there, what can be built upon. Because if we keep talking over and over again about this tool, that tool in the present moment, that's always changing. It's always going to change with the product roadmaps, with the ownership by Wall Street. And until we start bit by bit prioritizing together to build collective infrastructure, we're going to have the same conversation, but it'll be just different software tools every 5 years.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you all so much for the really robust conversation. I would love to stay on the phone and answer all of the questions in the Q&A. We will absolutely be answering them to you in, as I say, written or video form, and we'll put our heads together for what potential follow-up webinars could be really helpful. We appreciate everyone taking part in this. And, at the beginning, I said that I really loved CRMs because they're the conduit to deeper conversations, both about our own organizational structures and our ecosystem's shared infrastructure. So please keep your eye on our newsletters and blogs and those of the folks on the panel. We will be continuing this partnership to figure out how we can better serve the tech stacks that support independent revenue generation for all of our groups. The Progressive Multiplier will be launching its Convergence later this summer, which will be a home for all things information about independent revenue generation, including all of this CRM guidance and the tools that we can put together. So again, truly appreciate everyone's time. And if we can be of any help in this vein around CRMs or independent revenue, please reach out to any of us. And thank you again to our panelists. Cannot thank you enough for sharing your brilliance and your time today. Take care, all.